All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 87, Part 3. Reverend William Smith, 1727-1803, Penn's forgotten founder. Recorded on May 28, 2026. There are a lot of Smiths in America. In fact, Smith has been the country's most common surname since the first census in 1790. That makes it oddly fitting that one of the University of Pennsylvania's most important founders had such an ordinary name. But the Reverend William Smith, Penn's first provost, was anything but ordinary. Now, to understand why he matters, we have to go back to the colonial beginnings of higher education in British North America. This is really a story about what a college in the New World was supposed to be, and about what happened when Benjamin Franklin's broad practical vision met William Smith's more structured Anglican one. Most early colleges in British North America were founded to serve religious communities, and in one way or another to educate clergy. Harvard and Yale were tied to Congregationalists, Princeton to Presbyterians, William and Mary, King's College, later Columbia, to the Church of England, Brown to the Baptists, Rutgers to the Dutch Reformed Church. Over time, those schools broadened their missions, but they began in a world where higher education was expected to reinforce religion, moral order, and established leadership. Penn came out of that same world, but it pointed in a different direction. In 1749, Franklin laid out his plan in a pamphlet called Proposals Relating to the Education of Youth in Pennsylvania, with an odd spelling of the last word. He did not want simply another college for training ministers or preserving the old Latin-centered classical model. He wanted a school more open to instruction in English, more attentive to practical subjects, history, rhetoric, science, commerce, civic leadership. That proposal led to the Academy of Philadelphia, the precursor to the University of Pennsylvania. And that is worth a pause, because more open to instruction in English does not mean Latin vanished from Penn, not even close. In fact, Penn kept not just a classic curriculum, but a full Latin department well into the 20th century. The early academy also had a Latin school, really a preparatory track for boys headed into the college. And under Smith, it became part of the pipeline by which students were examined and moved upward into higher study. That separate Latin school survived the 1791 Union, but like so many older academic subdivisions, it eventually disappeared as Penn reorganized itself in the 19th century into something more recognizably modern. So even an institution built to challenge the old model carried a good deal of that old model forward. If you check the UPenn catalog, Latin is still taught at several levels. But now it's part of the classics department. William Smith was in every sense a transatlantic figure. He was born in Aberdeen in 1727. He studied at the University of Aberdeen, then he taught in Scotland. He came to British North America in 1751 as a tutor on Long Island. 2 years later, he published A General Idea of the College of Merania, a blueprint for an ideal college. It was still grounded in religion, Latin, Greek, rhetoric, and moral philosophy, but it also made room for mathematics, science, history, politics, modern languages, and practical preparation for public life. It was less a rejection of the old model than an attempt to modernize it for the new world. That essay that Smith wrote caught the attention of Franklin and Richard Peters in Philadelphia. Peters was yet another Anglican clergyman, which already tells you something about how non-sectarian institutions tend to get started in the 18th century. But Peters was also a political insider. He was a founding trustee of the Academy of Philadelphia. Later, he was president of its board. If Franklin was imagining a new kind of school, Peters was one of the people standing at the exact crossroads of religion, politics, and education, where that school would have to be built. And Smith's educational philosophy helps explain why. He believed a college should form morally disciplined, classically educated leaders for the church, public life, and the learned professions. He valued order, rhetoric, ethical formation, and religion joined to reason. In short, a distinctly Anglican vision of higher learning. He would still recognize the Episcopal tradition's concern for character, worship, service, and leadership, but if he were around today, it would probably strike him as strange, as the modern emphasis on pluralism, inclusion, and social justice as a defining educational mission. It was in the early 1750s. Franklin and Smith came together because each saw something useful in the other. Franklin saw an energetic and articulate educator who could help him turn the Academy of Philadelphia into a real college. Smith saw the institutional backing he needed to put his ideas into practice. And this partnership looked very, very promising at first. But the disagreement was there from the beginning. They agreed on the need for a stronger institution before they fully agreed on what kind of institution it ought to be. And the trouble between Franklin and Smith was never confined to one issue, which is part of why it became so hard to contain. They disagreed about the kind of college they were building. Franklin wanted something broader, more practical, more genuinely non-sectarian, while Smith leaned toward a more classical and more distinctly Anglican model. But those educational differences did not stay in the realm of theory for long. They played out inside the College of Philadelphia, inside its board, inside the increasingly bitter politics of Pennsylvania itself. Smith moved closer and closer to the Penn family and the proprietary interest. Franklin found himself working more closely with the Quaker-led assembly, especially on questions of defense. So what might have remained an argument about curriculum and institutional character turned into a fight about power, loyalty, and who would control the future of the schools. By the mid-1750s, the breach was no longer just philosophical. Penn's own archives say the two men were almost immediately at odds over whether military power in the colony should rest with the people or with the proprietary interest. And once that argument spilled out into public print, the temperature rose very quickly. By late April 1756, the so-called Franklinists were calling Smith a minister of the infernal prince of darkness and the father of lies. And his writings were being described as, quote, the vomitings of an infamous hireling, aimed against a man whose public spirit and disinterested services we have had many years of experience. You'll notice that 18th century political prose was rarely accused of understatement. Smith, for his part, just took it. Just kidding. He was not in a forgiving mood. He published a pamphlet that was reproduced in the Pennsylvania Journal on May 20th. He answered that Franklin only pretended to be an advocate for utility and peace while really sowing discord, giving way to envy and party rancor, and trying to make the people subservient to dirty purposes of private ambition. So if there had been any chance at all of this remaining a disagreement among colleagues, that chance was now gone. Quote, Franklin pretends to be an advocate for unity and peace. At the same time, he is sowing the seeds of discord, blowing the coals of party heat into a flame. He has a mind so ungenerous as to give way to the sordid passions of envy and party rancor. His chief aim is to imprint his own corrupt notions of government upon the minds of the people and render them subservient to dirty purposes of private ambition, and so on, and so on. And in 1756, Benjamin Franklin, the man who had first conceived a place of higher learning for Pennsylvania, was pushed aside as president of the board and replaced by Richard Peters. At that moment, the quarrel was no longer just personal. It had become institutional. Smith then escalated matters further with a series of fierce anti-Quaker writings during the French and Indian War. These were fierce enough that he landed in jail in 1758. He believed that because Quakers would not fight or would not take an oath, they should lose the privilege of voting, a position that did not endear him to a Quaker-run city. But this is William Smith. Even the political disturbances come with a domestic subplot. The same year, he married Anne Moore, the daughter of his ally, Joseph Moore, whom he had met while they were jailed together. Together, he and his wife had 7 children. So if you're keeping score at home, this is 1758. He was in prison, there was controversy, he was married, he started a large family. It feels about right for a man who never seemed to have done anything on a small scale. By this time, the alliance between Smith and Franklin had curdled into open enmity. Franklin later wrote that he had made Smith his enemy, quote, by doing him too much kindness, end quote, which kind of sounds like the verdict of a man who felt the break had become final. With Franklin out of power, Smith served as provost until 1779 through the Revolutionary War, then again from 1789 until the creation of the modern University of Pennsylvania in 1791. And this is the part where, much as Franklin would probably hate to hear it, Smith did a great deal of the building. After Franklin's influence waned, Smith became the dominant force in shaping the College of Philadelphia. He helped turn a promising academy into a functioning college with a firmer curriculum, a more stable administrative structure, and enough institutional coherence to survive the colony's political feuds and later the upheavals of the Revolution. Now, that certainly does not make him the sole creator of Penn, and it does not mean he won every argument. It was worth winning. What it means is that Franklin supplied the original spark. Smith spent years tending the fire, and for a long stretch, the future of the school rested more in his hands than in Franklin's. And when I say Smith did a great deal of the building, I do not just mean that he occupied the office for a long time. He shaped the place in ways that lasted. Penn's own history credits him with designing the course of study that became the backbone of the college for decades. He built a pipeline from the Latin school into the college, set standards for admissions, helped create a curriculum that combined classical languages, mathematics, natural philosophy, ethics, logic, history, oratory, whatever one thinks of his politics, and I do have plenty of thoughts on that. The man understood how to take an idea and turn it into an institution. The school itself was still small, urban, and a little improvised. It first took shape at 4th and Arch Streets in the large unfinished building originally put up for George Whitefield's preaching and charity school plans. Franklin liked the site because it was central, useful immediately, and had some room to grow, which is a very Franklin way to choose real estate. It was bigger than the State House, later Independence Hall, which sounds grand, until you remember that this was not yet a leafy campus spread over generous grounds. It was compact city property, roughly a quarter of a block. But with all the advantages and limitations that came with that, access to the life of Philadelphia, yes, but also the constraints of an institution trying to become a university before universities really looked the way we now expect them to look. Even so, it grew. In September of 1751, Franklin had said the new school already had more than 100 paying students. That's not bad for an institution that had barely opened its doors. The college charter followed in 1755, and the first degrees were awarded in 1757. A dormitory was added in 1763, and in 1765, Penn established the first medical school in North America. The Revolution then disrupted everything. Then again, that's kind of the point of revolutions, isn't it? When the Revolution came, Smith did not exactly cover himself in patriotic ambiguity. He was a Tory. He was suspected of writing a series of anti-independence essays published in Philadelphia in the spring of 1776 under the title Cato's Letters. These were aimed squarely at the revolutionary mood and in particular at the arguments of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Don't get these confused with the famous 18th century British Cato's Letters. Americans like to quote those about liberty and corruption. This was a local loyalist reuse of the name, which is somehow both intellectually respectable and a little opportunistic. The letters were pseudonymous, so Smith did not sign his name to them in a neat moment of self-incrimination. But later editors, rare book catalogs, and modern scholars have all pointed in his direction strongly enough that, quote, widely attributed is probably the safest phrase for Cato's letters. They were widely attributed to the Reverend Smith. After the Revolution, the old College of Philadelphia was displaced, rival institutions competed, and only in 1791 were they united under the name University of Pennsylvania. By 1801, the university had moved to 9th Street to a building designed by William Strickland, carrying the institution beyond its original colonial corner and into a new phase of growth. The final move to the sprawling West Philadelphia property would not come until after the American Civil War. After Smith lost his position in 1779, he did not retire into dignified obscurity. That was never his style. When the Pennsylvania Assembly voided the old College of Philadelphia charter during the Revolution, Smith, who had spent years tied to the proprietary interest and had urged reconciliation with Britain longer than was politically comfortable, found himself out of power and out of step with the movement. But he was not punished in any way for his political beliefs. So he went to Maryland. There he became a principal of the Kent County Free School in Chestertown and soon helped turn it into Washington College, while George Washington was still alive. This was one of the first colleges chartered in the United States. In other words, even after losing the institution that had defined much of his career, Smith did what he usually did. He went off and tried to build another one. But Penn was still not finished with him. In 1789, when the old College of Philadelphia was restored, William Smith returned as provost. And when the rival institutions were merged in 1791 under the new charter of the University of Pennsylvania, he remained deeply involved as professor of ethics, long-serving secretary of the board, and briefly as president of the board itself. Now, by then, he was also active in shaping the post-revolutionary Episcopal Church. He remained a fixture in Philadelphia's learned world through the American Philosophical Society, where he lectured, edited, and generally continued being William Smith. His later years were spent not just in clerical and educational work, but in publishing, church organization, and the kind of improvement schemes and land ventures that tend to appear whenever ambitious 18th century men feel they have one more chapter left in them. So, how much should we admire William Smith? Well, that depends on how much patience you have for men described even in their own day as haughty, slovenly, and often offensive in company. Whether that offense lay in his opinions, his manners, or his personal grooming is not specified, but I sort of suspect the answer may have been yes. In a 1760 issue of the Pennsylvania Gazette, sermons by Smith were advertised for sale, 1 shilling 6 pence, under the magnificently 18th century title, A Discourse Concerning the Conversion of the Heathen Americans and the Final Propagation of Christianity and the Sciences to the Ends of the Earth. It was published in 2 parts. Late in his life, this pious, moralistic man became an abuser of alcohol, and when he died in 1803, it was reported that none of his children attended the funeral. According to what I can put together from files in the archives, and an 1869 book I found online about the beginnings and development of East Falls and Manayunk, Smith had an impressive estate not far from the cemetery where he now resides. Quote, "There were a number of beautiful country seats in the vicinity of the falls, occupied in the summer season by parties from the city. They were remarkably healthy and delightful seats until the chills and fever of 1821, after which mostly abandoned. On the hill, now North Laurel Hill Cemetery, was the county seat of Joseph Sims. Next below, that of the Willing family, afterwards Peppers. And aside here, that's now Central Laurel Hill East. Next below that, now South Laurel Hill, was William Rawls' place. On the upper side of the Ridge Road stood Governor Mifflin's house. On the right of the Indian Queen Lane, a short half-mile from the Ridge Road, was the seat of Mr. Nicklin. Then there were Dr. Smith's houses and adjoining Mr. Carson's." So he was up near Indian Queen Lane, not far from Ridge Avenue. From another source, I found that in August of 1757, Dr. Smith had bought 7 acres at a sheriff's sale on both sides of the Wissahickon Ridge Road near the falls. He added to that purchase over time, and by 1764 he held 5 contiguous lots at the Falls of Schuylkill. This gave him one of the most substantial private estates in the area. The property was improved by 1762 because on June 2nd, 1762, Hannah Callender recorded in her diary that she had seen Smith's octagon. The house took its name from its semi-octagonal bay, and an engraving that's dated 1794, which I was not able to find. It had a cupola and several wings. It suggested that it was grown in stages rather than being built all at once. It was set high on a hillside. The dwelling commanded broad views up and down the Schuylkill and stood well above the riverbank buildings shown in the 1794 view, including structures near Falls Run and the clubhouse of Fort St. David's. For a long time, I did not know this, for many, many years, Manayunk was known as Fort St. David's. The comment was that it was not architecturally grand in a formal sense, but the accumulated additions made it picturesque, and the site itself gave the estate a commanding presence in the landscape. This was among the earliest country seats that were built near the falls. It was sometimes called a mansion. Smith's Folly was another name that was attached to the property. To the millers and the fishermen nearby, it must have looked imposing indeed. And by the 1780s and 1790s, Smith appears to have held the most valuable real estate in the neighborhood. The hillside tract included more than the principal house. 2 additional dwellings stood on the property, and the group of structures was remembered as the mansion, the hexagon house, and the octagon building. Taken together, they suggest not a single elegant villa, but an evolving estate assembled over years that reflected both Smith's ambition and the growing importance of his position. I wish I could find pictures of this. This slender volume also gave me an anecdote about Reverend Smith and his neighbors. Quote, I recollect an anecdote of Godfrey Schrank and a celebrated character who resided at the Falls, Dr. Smith, an eminent divine of the Episcopal Church and first provost of the college, afterwards the University of Pennsylvania. He built those 3 clusters of strange buildings on the hill, nearly opposite the old Falls Tavern, among which was the Octagon Building, Smith's Folly as it was called, and here's the key, a vault in which his remains and others of his family were deposited on the brow of the hill. The doctor, who was celebrated among other things for his fondness of good dinners, undertook on a certain occasion to reprimand Godfrey Schrank for fishing on a Sunday. When he replied, Doctor, if your dinner laid at the bottom of the Schuylkill, you would be very apt to fish for it. Now, in the archives of Laurel Hill, I found his burial transfer note. It's dated August 18, 1854. It's on the family lot's interment sheet, which has 4734 on it, and that's crossed out, and there's a red stamp number, 4202. Crabbed handwriting. This took me forever to figure out. It's jammed on the front of this sheet. It appears that Reverend Smith and his family were moved, quote, from Falls of Schuylkill, end quote, to Section G. Now he shares his final resting place with other Smiths. The back of this document carefully lists the 7 people whose bodies were moved downhill to the cemetery. This plot had been purchased by Smith's grandson, Richard Penn Smith, the playwright who more or less invented the whole Davy Crockett myth out of whole cloth. That's something I went into at some length in All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, number 63, Part 1. So the mystery was solved to me. I could not figure out that little note about move from Schuylkill Falls. I thought there was an abandoned cemetery somewhere that I knew nothing about.
Oh, yeah, one more thing. The Reverend William Smith, he enslaved his fellow human beings. Records show that he owed at least 1 enslaved person in 1769. Later, when he was at Washington College, he brought a teenage girl with him, acquired another enslaved person in 1783, and in 1803 he sold a third who had already tried twice to escape. So, Whatever else Smith was, educator, clergyman, institutional builder, he was also a man fully willing to participate in slavery when it suited his household and his ambitions. It still stands to reason that the University of Pennsylvania should honor its most famous founder with a good deal of ceremony. And it does. That most famous founder is Benjamin Franklin. There is an enormous seated Franklin in front of College Hall, that building in all its green serpentine majesty. The statue was sculpted by John J. Boyle, commissioned in 1896 by department store magnate Justice Clayton Strawbridge, and initially was set on a granite base designed by Frank Miles Day. The 81-inch bronze was unveiled in 1899 in front of the old post office at 9th and Chestnut, sort of a fitting spot for the first Postmaster General. That building came down in 1930 and replaced by the Art Deco masterpiece that stands there now. The city placed the statue on indefinite loan to Penn, and it was rededicated on campus on Founders Day, January 21st, 1939. But what about Smith? Now, you might reasonably assume Smith Walk is named for him. There's a campus full of accumulated memory and selective amnesia. That would make perfect sense. But William Smith is remembered much less visibly than Edgar Fahs Smith, whose statue anchors Smith Walk, and whose name most visitors probably assume the walk commemorates. As for the first provost, his memorial is more modest. There's a plaque in the Provost Smith Lounge at the Fisher-Hassenfeld College House. The university does not even own the best-known portrait of Smith, the Gilbert Stuart likeness, painted a year or two before Smith died. Stuart had come to the Philadelphia area, more specifically Germantown, in the 1790s. He had the very practical ambition of painting George Washington, which he did more than once. Stuart rented his house and studio from none other than the Reverend William Smith. So a portrait was, if not inevitable, at least highly likely. Stuart also painted Smith's wife. Now, it appears Smith's painting by Gilbert Stuart stayed in the Smith family for more than 2 centuries. It comes up for auction at Sotheby's, New York in 2007. It was purchased by the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. So I checked the museum's website, and I got one more final little indignity. The portrait of William Smith was, quote, not currently on display.